Peter B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins News and Comment. It's Thursday, May 31st, 2018. And as Trump keeps pissing on his own toes, a fascinating new analysis and recap of Russiagate has been published by international reporter Daniel Lazare at consortiumnews.com. And I find it very helpful because in recent weeks we've had some new characters introduced. Stefan Halper, whose identity was so secret that disclosing it was going to bring down the national security establishment, damage sources and methods and ongoing investigations, only it didn't. And Stefan Halper's connections to representatives of British intelligence and Christopher Steele, and even perhaps Sergei Skripal. Yes, the plot is thickening, and in ways that the corporate media in this country is not really handling very well. And those media outlets have been so busy promoting the leaks from our own national intelligence community that they have a hard time wrapping themselves around any kind of alternative theories. And when I was on vacation last week, I talked to a number of people in Southern California about my skeptical view of the whole Russiagate scandal. And oh, did I take a lot of crap. One good friend who was working on the Hillary Clinton campaign said that Russia is going to manipulate the 2018 elections. And I said, Catherine, how? And she was completely at a loss to explain exactly how they would do that. She mumbled things about Facebook ads and that sort of thing. I said, really? They're going to interfere in 435 House races or just some subset of them? And just how do they pull that off? And she got frustrated with me and said, are you a Trump supporter? And that's how far this has gone, how far downhill it's gone. That if you don't accept the prevailing narrative, the consensus view promoted by the Post, the Times, and MSDNC, then, well, you must be a Trump supporter. But Daniel Lazare's piece today, I encourage you to read the entire thing, helps us understand that Stefan Halper may have been the offshore coordinator of the scheme to embarrass Trump, to create, if not expose, ties. Let me put it the other way, expose, if not create and expose, ties with alleged Russian operatives. Well, what Lazare's piece is headlined is Spooks Spooking Themselves. And he writes the intelligence agencies initiated reports that Trump was colluding with Russia, then nurtured them, helped them grow, then they spread the word to the press and key government officials. Reportedly, he says, they even tried to use these reports to force Trump to step down prior to his inauguration. The template was provided by former MI6 director, that's Britain's equivalent of the CIA, Richard Dearlove, who is a close friend of Stefan Halper and a business partner. And he imagines them sitting in wing chairs in London's Garrick Club, with Dearlove telling MI6 veteran Christopher Steele that Trump reminded him of a predicament he'd faced years earlier when he was chief of station for British intelligence in Washington, and alerted U.S. authorities to British information that a vice presidential hopeful had once been in communication with the Kremlin. So Lazare ticks off a list of the characters in this subplot here, including Halper, who is known as the Walrus, apparently for his impressive girth. I've never seen a picture of him. He includes Steele and Dearlove, and adds Robert Hannigan, former head of the UK's equivalent to the NSA, GCHQ, plus Alexander Downer, a top Australian diplomat who tipped off his drunken conversation with George Papadopoulos. Then we've got Andrew Wood, the former British ambassador to Moscow, Joseph Mifsud, the Maltese academic, and James Clapper and John Brennan, who are well known to my American listeners. So, what he offers here is a very credible alternative scenario for Russiagate, hatched by spies and amplified by spies until they could get it into the corporate media. And he shares information I didn't know, that Dearlove and Halper are partners in a private venture called the Cambridge Security Initiative. Both are connected to another London-based intelligence firm known as Hacklut and Company. That's a strange name, Haklut. Halper is connected through 2 books that he wrote with the people who work at Hacklut, Jonathan Clark, and Dearlove has a close Dearlove has a close personal friendship with the founder of Hacklut, Mike Reynolds, another MI6 veteran. Alexander Downer served a half-dozen years on Hacklut's International Advisory Board, while Andrew Wood is linked to Steele via Orbis Business Intelligence, the research company that was the subcontractor to Fusion GPS, hired secretly by Perkins Coie, in a way to avoid disclosure that the Clinton campaign was paying for it through their law firm. Back in 2014, Halper notified U.S. intelligence that Mike Flynn had grown overly chummy with an Anglo-Russian scholar named Svetlana Lokova. Suspicions that Lokova argues are absurd. And at the end of the election cycle, at the end of 2016, Halper and Dearlove both resigned from Cambridge Intelligence Seminar because they suspected a company footing some of the costs was tied up with Russian intelligence, which Lazare dismisses as absurd. Lazare continues, as head of Britain's Foreign Secret Intelligence Service, as MI6 is formally known, Dearlove played a major role in drumming up support for the invasion of Iraq. So, coming to the present case, starting in 2015, GCHQ, along with intelligence agencies in Poland, Estonia, and Germany, began monitoring what they said were suspicious interactions between figures connected to Trump and known or suspected Russian agents. Now, this is a much earlier start than what we've heard from James Comey and other American sources. Lazare continues. The pace accelerated in March 2016 when a 30-year-old policy consultant named Papadopoulos joined the Trump campaign. Traveling in Italy a week later, he ran into Mifsud, the London-based Maltese academic, who reportedly set about cultivating him after learning of his Trump connection. And it was Mifsud who claimed to, quote, have substantial connections with Russian government officials. And over breakfast in London, he told Papadopoulos he'd just come back from Moscow, where he learned that the Russians had dirt on Hillary Clinton in the form of thousands of emails. Now, if we can draw a direct connection between Mifsud, Dearlove, and Halper, well, they could have been the people who set the trap for Carter Page and George Papadopoulos. Because while we've been led to think by the New York Times that Mifsud is a big fan of Vladimir Putin, Julian Assange tweeted photos of Mifsud with British Foreign Secretary Boris Johnson and a high-ranking British intelligence official named Claire Smith at a training session for Italian security agents in Rome. So that's not proof of anything, but it does discourage us from believing that Mifsud had ties to Moscow instead of to British intelligence. And after Papadopoulos caused a flap by telling a reporter that David Cameron, the British Prime Minister at the time, should apologize for criticizing Trump's anti-Muslim statements, a friend in the Israeli embassy put him in touch with a friend at the Australian embassy who introduced him to Downer, and over drinks, Downer advised him to be more diplomatic, and that's where Papadopoulos passed along Mifsud's tip about Clinton's emails. And asking the question in a subheader here, was Papadopoulos set up? Lazare says, well, suspicions are unavoidable, but evidence is lacking. He's a lot more honest than what we read in the corporate media, where they draw conclusions based on links and anonymous sources and leaked evidence that we're not permitted to see. And so I'm not trying to sell you on this. I would like you to absorb it, think about it critically, and see if you can hold two thoughts at the same time. I believe many of my listeners can do that. And that is that Trump is corrupt, he's running a cover-up, but that these issues related to Russiagate could have been framed around him. And so we know that Stephen Halper has a history of being a campaign infiltrator during the Clinton-Reagan campaign of 1980 with the Iranian October surprise. And Lazare suggests that Halper sought a permanent post in the Trump administration, a reward. Or was he a mole trying to burrow in? So I consider this fascinating. I think it's much more compelling and credible than much of what we read in the corporate media here in the United States. And while Trump, as I say, continues to just shit all over himself, pardon my language, but he, of course, issued a statement today, another tweet, saying that it's the corrupt mainstream media pushing a false storyline that he fired Comey because of Russiagate. Now, he himself is the source of that. He told Lester Holt of NBC in May of 2017, you know, this Russia thing with Trump and Russia is a made-up story. It's an excuse by the Democrats. And that contradicted the official reasoning written by Rod Rosenstein that it was because of Comey's interference with Hillary Clinton's investigation that he had to be fired. And so Trump is not helping himself in a situation where the newly revealed information about Stephen Halper may actually buttress his case. Meanwhile, we get more information from a memo that has presumably been leaked from the leak-proof Mueller investigation. Now, because it's been leaked, we don't know the actual source. It could have come from the guy who wrote the secret memo, Andrew McCabe, who was the acting FBI director at the time. It may have been leaked from Rod Rosenstein, although it doesn't help his cause. But the most likely source is somebody aligned with the Mueller investigation. Now, that aside, what the memo does is tell us about the discussions at the Justice Department immediately after Comey was fired by Trump. And the article I'm referring to here notes correctly, Rosenstein played an important role in the firing, having written the memo, faulting Comey for his handling of the Hillary Clinton email investigation. And the White House then held that up as the justification for Trump's decision to fire Comey. And according to the McCabe memo, Rosenstein indicated that he was initially asked by Trump to reference the Russia investigation in his memo on the Comey firing, but he didn't. And that's why Trump put it in the cover letter that was so curious, his official notification to Comey that he was being sacked. Thanks for mentioning that I'm not under investigation. One of the most awkward termination letters I've ever seen. But this raises a series of issues. Number one, can Rod Rosenstein be trusted? He followed orders to write the memo to fire Comey. Then he opened the investigation and named the special counsel, Robert Mueller, to conduct it. Is that a shell game, a cover game, and ultimately will Rosenstein return to form? Pocket the report from Mueller and say, thank you very much, that was great. We're not going to do anything about it. And so this sets up Rod Rosenstein as a target from both the Clinton side and the Trump side. Should he recuse himself? Well, he said that if that is requested by Director Mueller, that he will. But then who replaces him? Who does Mueller report to? And this points up the problems that Jeff Sessions has now. With yesterday's revelation from the New York Times about Trump's effort to get Sessions to unrecuse himself, the threats to fire him for failing to do so, we have the specter that Rod Rosenstein and Jeff Sessions ultimately could be asked to testify against Trump in a grand jury hearing or other inquiry by Bob Mueller. It is so messy. And it's really hard to trust any of these people. Starting with Mueller and Comey for their history as running a corrupt FBI, They may be useful and honest in the current circumstance, but I, for one, have not forgotten the history here. Then there's the independence of Rosenstein. He's not independent. And it's just a sordid mess. As you may know, I am a deep fan of Trevor Aronson's work. He writes for The Intercept now, and he published a book called Terror Factory about how the FBI uses its paid informants, some 15,000, to frame often innocent parties who happen to be Muslim Americans for alleged terrorist crimes. And today at The Intercept, I think that Aronson does a good job of explaining the official policy of the FBI about its informants and how Stephen Halper was offshore, and that the rules are even tighter about how he should be managed as an informant. And it's an interesting piece. I encourage you to read it. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. But he argues with whether or not Stephen Halper was a spy. And he says that, these informants are collecting information and coughing it up. It does fit the definition of a spy. But then, curiously, Aronson argues that the FBI most likely played by the rules when it came to using this offshore informant, Stephen Halper. And I have a hard time believing that they went by the book, or at least presuming that. If they can prove they did, I will accept that. And so the ending of this article I find a little bit unsatisfying, but why don't you read it and see what you think? Also at The Intercept today, a lengthy piece by James Risen, the former Pulitzer Prize-winning New York Times reporter who jumped to The Intercept in the past year. It's part 3 in a 3-part series about Russiagate, and I've quibbled with the arguments advanced by Risen in the first 2 installments. This one, I don't. He is focused on whether or not Donald Trump is vulnerable to charges of obstruction of justice. He writes, I believe that it is obvious, and has been for more than a year, that Trump is doing everything he can to obstruct any investigation into evidence of collusion between his campaign and Russia. If that means discrediting the FBI, Justice, and other government agencies, Trump will do it. Well, I agree. And as I've argued, he has been running a cover-up, and I think Risen does a good job of detailing it. Now we turn to Sergei Skripal. And it is Craig Murray who connects Sergei Skripal to Orbis, the Christopher Steele entity, and to possible connection to the Steele dossier and related connections that we may not know about today. And I've linked to his recent blog post, which he wrote after Yulia Skripal, the daughter of the former Russian double agent, spoke to the camera and read a written statement. We don't know who wrote it. And in reacting to that, Craig Murray notes that the new development is that Skripal had not retired but was active for MI6 on gigs briefing overseas intelligence agencies about Russia, that still there is no proof of the source of the alleged Novichok nerve agent that was applied to a doorknob. Murray quibbles about how difficult it would be to apply that to a doorknob and not have the person applying it be affected or afflicted by the nerve agent. And there's more. In The Independent, an article written by Mary Dejevsky on May 24th raises the serious and continuing questions from the Skripal episode. What we have here, she says, is an attempt by the UK to limit the damage to its own reputation. Damage perhaps it never envisaged because it assumed everyone would buy the wicked Russia story. And the reason this has to be done was that the UK's silence, a media blackout, had become embarrassing. It invited unwelcome questions. Perhaps it also risked the UK's triumph in orchestrating a collective Western expulsion of Russian diplomats. The more persistent questions have come from journalists not in Britain, and I'll add, not in the United States, but in Italy, Germany, and elsewhere. And she has pages. It goes on for almost 2 pages of questions. Why is there no suspect beyond Russia? Why was there no international or national manhunt for a culprit? There was fleeting suggestion an individual might have fled on the same plane he arrived on, and then silence. When the National Security Advisor of Britain, Sir Mark Sedwill, appeared before the Parliament 3 weeks ago, he said there were as yet no suspects. That is an extraordinary, hardly credible admission. There's much more to the story. Check it out. Trump has, with almost no notice, launched a trade war against allies, the European Union, Canada, and Mexico, over steel and aluminum. As of midnight tonight, there will be a 25% tariff on steel imported, 10% on aluminum. And this is so reckless and arbitrary. It is going to lead to higher prices for American products. It will cut off supply lines for American manufacturing. And we will be forced to pay more for imported goods in retaliation for this just stupid move by Trump. Trump's latest Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, concluded meetings with the top North Korean diplomat Kim Yong-chol. The meetings ended about 90 minutes earlier than expected, and there was no announcement about the outcome. But Pompeo tweeted that it was a good discussion, and Trump tweeted today that he is expecting the delegation from North Korea to be at the White House tomorrow and to deliver a letter from Kim Jong-un. So maybe that's where an announcement will be made about the meetings that are currently scheduled in Singapore for June the 12th. The ceasefire between Israel and the Palestinians in Gaza appears to be holding, and Mondoweiss has published a good recap of the recent events. And I mentioned that it was hard to figure out from U.S. corporate media what came before what. Well, Mondoweiss says, the timeline proves that Israel is provoking the latest violence. On Sunday, Israeli tanks killed 3 members of a small Islamic Jihad group who were inside Gaza. The Israeli military said it killed the 3 because a bomb had been planted, but there is no proof that the 3 dead had anything to do with that alleged bomb. In response, Islamic Jihad and Hamas supposedly fired 70 mortars or rockets into Israel, killing no one, but allegedly injuring 3 soldiers and 1 civilian. And this led to the retaliation disproportionately by Israel. And they dinged the New York Times, failing to report that during months of murderous Israeli aggression against Gazan civilians, the Palestinians had not launched a single rocket before this past week. The Times also alleges that over the months of protest, incendiary kites and balloons have caused hundreds of fires in the fields and forest on the Israeli side, and we have no evidence to support that. Then they talk about how the Times waited until paragraph 32 in their article to report that Israel, since March 30th, has killed 120 Palestinians and omitted the thousands of people who have been injured. And finally, the Times article nowhere explains that many in Israel believe that Netanyahu is deliberately increasing tensions in Gaza and elsewhere to distract attention from the multiple corruption probes zeroing in on him and his wife. There's a great piece at Consortium News today from Chaz W. Freeman, Jr., the former American diplomat to the Middle East, who's been a guest on this podcast a couple of times. And I encourage you to read it. Don't have time to really comment on it. But in the conclusion, he does warn of the very real danger that the low-intensity conflict now underway between Israel and Iran in Syria and the Gulf Arabs' proxy wars with Iran could escalate into a major war. In a mini-wave of presidential clemency that could be interpreted as signals to Michael Cohen and others not to flip on Trump, the president has announced a pardon for Dinesh D'Souza and that he is considering a commutation for the corrupt former Illinois governor, Democrat Rod Blagojevich, and that he's also thinking about some sort of relief for Martha Stewart. He believes that all 3 of these people were improperly targeted by the Justice Department and that they were at least over-convicted. And that's why I think he's sending a signal to Mike Cohen saying, hang in there, buddy. Just take the heat, take the fall, and if I'm still in office, I'll give you a pardon. And all of this ties back to people, like Blagojevich and Martha Stewart, who have ties to the Apprentice TV show. And Blagojevich published a plea in the Wall Street Journal. I don't know for a fact, but I imagine it was featured on Fox and Friends, and that's how Trump decided to take up his cause. But also, Martha Stewart is the subject of a chapter in James Comey's book, A Higher Loyalty, where he talked about how he agonized over whether or not to prosecute her. But it's important to note that Dinesh D'Souza knowingly violated campaign finance laws by having his mistress and his personal assistant make $10,000 contributions to a Republican Senate candidate with the understanding that he would pay them back. And that's a clear violation of the law. So this was not something where he was railroaded or framed. And he got 5 years probation, a $30,000 fine. He's also a really repugnant tweeter. After the students in Parkland, Florida protested, he said that the school shooting was the worst news since their parents told them to get summer jobs. And he has, I don't have it here, but he tweeted a neener to Preet Bharara, the district attorney who prosecuted him, and basically said, karma is a bitch. Preet Bharara wanted to destroy a fellow Indian American to advance his career. Then he got fired, and I got pardoned. Dinesh D'Souza is a lowlife. I won't call him an animal, just a lowlife. So the right wing is all up in arms, and they're employing political correctness to try to make a false equivalency between a crude comment by Samantha Bee on her comedy show last night and the racist tweet earlier this week that cost Roseanne Barr her TV show and pretty much what's left of her career. Now, what Samantha Bee said was in a tirade against the Trump White House, and she singled out Ivanka for being, for not really following through on the promise that she was going to soften the extreme positions of her father. So, Samantha Bee talked about a tweet where Ivanka published a photo of her and one of her kids. You know, Ivanka, that's a beautiful photo of you and your child. But let me just say, one mother to another, do something about your dad's immigration practices, you feckless cunt. Now, I apologize for that word. I know that it's deeply offensive to many people. But I'm quoting a woman, comedian, using that term against another female. And while TBS bleeped it out, it's pretty apparent what she said. And I don't condone this kind of crude language and personal attack. But the Trumps have no reason to believe that they should have any kind of protection from crude comments, from personal attacks, or even from things that might be a little bit unfair. Because they're the ones who lowered the standard, who launched the war on political correctness. And when liberals use the same license, they're told, oh, that's way out of line. I heard Rush Limbaugh this morning chattering on about this and making it seem like what Roseanne tweeted was no big deal. But Samantha Bee used the C word on Ivanka Trump. A couple of tweets that were singled out by BuzzFeed here. Here's Matt Walsh. I have no problem calling for the firing of Samantha Bee. Her show is atrocious, her rhetoric vile and revolting. TBS should get rid of her, and we should demand they do so. I supported ABC firing Roseanne, and I will call for TBS to be held to same standard. It's not the same standard, Mr. Walsh. It simply is not. This is more accurate, Adam Best. Right-wing America comparing harsh dissent over real issues from Samantha Bee to blatant anti-Semitism and racism from Roseanne shows that conservatives still don't take bigotry seriously enough. Bee could have used a less offensive word, but this is an obvious false equivalency. A transgender woman who came all the way from Honduras with the caravan that freaked Trump out so much that he peed his pants and sent the National Guard to the border, Roxana Hernandez, died in the custody of Immigrations and Customs Enforcement in what they call an icebox, ICE detention facilities notorious for freezing temperatures. She was HIV positive, and she died from related complications. And this will be investigated, but this is really pretty common. The treatment of immigrants in a subhuman manner. You know, animals. That's what Trump calls them. A lot of people have seen the footage in social media of the 20-year-old woman who was at the beach in New Jersey last weekend when a cop came up, gave her a breathalyzer test, and then she gave him some lip because she hadn't been drinking. And he proceeded to arrest her in a brutally violent manner, and it's appalling. I'm glad there was video, and I hope there will be appropriate discipline. But in the case of Carol Schuler, who is the wife of the intrepid journalist and blogger Roger Schuler, when she was brutalized by a Missouri sheriff's deputy during an attempted eviction from a rental unit, well, Carol has been convicted of assault on a law enforcement officer, even though the charge was that she had contact with a law enforcement officer. And as Roger points out in a well-written blog post today that I've linked to in the show file for this podcast, the judge in the case, Jerry Harmison, conflated civil and criminal law. It was a criminal proceeding, but he used a civil law argument that, well, the relevant evidence in this case is that the Greene County deputies evicting Roger and Carol Schuler were acting in good faith. Now, the fact that they busted into the apartment when the eviction was not legally enforceable, and they brutalized Carol to the extent that her arm was fractured in a very serious fashion. Instead, the officers are being exonerated. Carol Schuler will live the rest of her life with a mangled arm. And while she doesn't face jail time based on the charges and the arrangements to date, she will stand as convicted of contact with a police officer in a trial that is just the latest deep injustice to Roger and Carol Schuler. And if you're in a position to help them out, they're living week to week in a flea bag motel in Missouri as they continue to pursue legal claims in both Alabama and Missouri. If you can help them out, follow the link to legalschnauzer.blogspot.com, and even if it's just $5 or $10 that you can kick in, I know it will be helpful, and your show of support will be very meaningful to them at this difficult time. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. We give it away free. You can find it on YouTube, and I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.